Welcome to Life at the Academy, a midshipman-produced podcast that examines how the culture, traditions, and daily life of midshipmen have evolved over time. I'm Midshipman Nels Waranimi.
And I'm Midshipman Calvin Tran.
Calvin, our episode today is about the first class of women to attend the Naval Academy. Can you give us a sense for what the average midshipman knows about the experiences of those women?
For sure, Nels. I think that most midshipmen would know that the first class of women to attend the Naval Academy was in 1976, and at the time they made up a very small portion of the brigade. They would also probably know about some notable female alumni from that time period, including Wendy Lawrence, who was from the class of 1981, and Admiral Michelle Howard, who was from the class of 1982.
However, we don't seem to have a good grasp of the day-to-day experiences of those women and some of the difficulties and hardships that they went through in order to be the first women to graduate from the Naval Academy.
I would agree with that. I think many midshipmen can probably visualize and understand why the introduction of women into the academy would be very tough for them and very tough for the brigade as a whole. But I think very midshipmen actually know about the individual stories and the day-to-day challenges and obstacles that these women have to face.
And at the same time, there was an adjustment for the males who were at the academy at the time as well, because the Naval Academy was an all-male culture, and it was centered around that kind of environment. So they must have had an adjustment as well.
I would agree with that, and I think that the inclusion of women at the academy as a whole forced the institution of the culture to drastically change in such a short period of time, and it also forced the brigade to address many societal issues which are still being addressed today at the academy through multiple education programs for sexual assault and prevention.
So to answer our questions about this time period at the Naval Academy, we've asked two guests to join us. One is a member of the first class of women to attend the Naval Academy, who graduated in 1980, and the other is her husband, who's a member of the class of 1981. Calvin, can you introduce our first guest?
Mrs. Sharon Hanley Disher graduated from the United States Naval Academy in 1980 in the first class with women and men, and was the first woman to graduate from the Naval Academy with a Bachelor of Science degree in Systems Engineering. She served in the Naval Civil Engineering Corps for 10 years, including her last tour of duty as the officer in charge of the Construction Battalion Unit 414 in New London, Connecticut, where she was the second woman in the Navy to ever hold such a position. In 1998, Mrs. Disher published her book entitled First Class: Women Join the Ranks at the Naval Academy, a story about the first class with both women and men at the Naval Academy. Mrs. Disher resides in Washington, D.C. with her husband, Tim Disher, a retired naval submariner and the current director of international programs at the Naval Academy. The Disher twins, Allison and Brett, are 2010 graduates of the Naval Academy, serving in the Navy and Marine Corps respectively, and their youngest son, Matthew, is a Naval Academy member of the class of 2013. The Disher family is the first family whose members all graduated from the Naval Academy. Today, Mrs. Disher is retired after teaching and creating STEM curriculum at Title I schools, where she worked diligently to grow our nation's next engineers and scientists.
Mr. Tim Disher graduated from the Naval Academy in 1981 and joined the submarine community. His at-sea assignments included USS John Adams, USS Will Rogers, Destroyer Squadron 32, and USS John C. Stennis, CVN 74. His shore assignments included Assistant Professor of Leadership at the Naval Reserve Officer Training Corps NROTC Unit, University of Washington in Seattle, Washington, and varying degrees of increased leadership at the submarine training facilities in Charleston, South Carolina, and Norfolk, Virginia. He was selected as a foreign area officer and assigned to serve as the liaison officer in Madrid, Spain, for all cooperative programs between the U.S. and Spanish navies. En route to Spain, he graduated with distinction from the Defense Language Institute with proficiency in the Spanish language. He is the author of several articles on the integration of international education at the United States Naval Academy. He has taught undergraduate courses on leadership, ethics, and culture. He retired from the U.S. Navy on 1 September 2007 and currently serves as the Director, International Programs Office at the United States Naval Academy. He is responsible for coordination of international engagement programs for faculty, staff, and the 4,500 midshipmen, including semester study abroad, immersion, and professional exchanges. In 2020, the U.S. Naval Academy was the first service academy to be recognized with the NAFSA Senator Paul Simon Award for Campus Internationalization for making significant, well-planned, well-executed, and well-documented progress toward comprehensive internationalization using innovative and creative approaches. With that, here was our conversation with Mr. and Mrs. Disher. Mr. and Mrs. Disher, thank you very much for joining us here today.
You're very welcome.
Pleasure to be here.
To start off, we would like to hear about why were you both interested in coming to the Academy itself, and just a little bit about your background before you came to the Academy.
So my dad was a pilot in the Air Force for 26 years, and I always wanted to be a pilot or a doctor. And I also wanted to join the military. Even if I'd gone to a civilian institution, I would have joined the military because I appreciated the not so much equal opportunity for women back then, but the equal pay and the travel, and I'd done it all my life. And so my dad, I was a senior in high school, and it was October, and I was trying to figure out what I was going to do. And my dad said, "Hey, what about the academies? They just opened up to women." And I said, "What's an academy?" and he told me, a great education, join the military, guaranteed job. And for me, I really just wanted to serve my country. So the fact that it was the first time for women wasn't really a draw for me. It was more about serving.
So my father was a pilot in the Navy. He was a 1957 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. So being a military brat, it was really a lifestyle that I became familiar with. And I went to high school in Virginia Beach, which wasn't too far from Annapolis. So we actually came up and visited a couple times. It was something that I was very impressed with. I also felt that I would have benefited from a more disciplined lifestyle at a university. So the Academy appealed in that regard. I also applied for ROTC, but fortunately I was accepted at the Naval Academy.
Could we turn to the application process? And particularly, we're interested in what it was like to apply to the Naval Academy, being that your class, Mrs. Disher, was the first one to include women.
Well, the process, I think, is just hard for anybody. I don't really remember anything in particular, specific to being a woman. I know there was a lot of interest with the press, and I actually applied to all 4 academies, Coast Guard, West Point, Air Force, and Navy, and got turned down by them all because I have no depth perception. So I had to get a waiver, and Air Force was the only one who wouldn't give me a waiver. And I immediately got into West Point, and by February of my senior year, I accepted the appointment because I hadn't heard back from Navy. And I had been selected as an alternate for Coast Guard because I think they only chose 13 women that year. So I picked West Point, accepted my appointment. And then in April, I got a call from Navy and came down here, and in a day, I changed my mind.
Mr. Disher, anything to add on that?
I can't really recall. My father, the nominating source was Ohio, and I was living in Virginia. So I do remember going up to Ohio, and it was through that congressman that I was actually nominated through. It turns out that the primary nomination was a female, one of my classmates, and I was an alternate from Ohio, and that was the process for me that I recall.
Mrs. Disher, when you first announced to your friends and your family and your community that you intended to apply to the Naval Academy, what was their reaction to that?
Well, it's funny because people ask me, why did I stay? And I always say, Patti LaBelle's mother. And they're like, Patti LaBelle? You knew Patti LaBelle's mother? And it's like, no, not that Patti LaBelle. Patti LaBelle was in the band with me. We played flute together in the band. And when she told her mother that I was going to the Naval Academy, her mother said, she'll never make it because she's too much of a party girl. and for me, that was like just the reason that I was going to stay. But so I remember that. And then I remember just the press. The press was all over us too. I was in the front page of the newspaper, and then lots of interviews, and which was fine. But I really, the notoriety for me was somewhat uncomfortable.
Next, we'd like to turn to what it was like to be a midshipman here, Mrs. Disher. Could you describe what it was like? What was the sexism like when you first came here to the Academy?
The first day, on I Day, at the end of the day, we went down to meal, And meal was surf and turf, which was lobster and steak. It was awesome. But by the end of the day, as you guys know, you're exhausted. And you've just said goodbye to your parents, and you're sad. And I just couldn't get out of there fast enough. And I was sitting at a table with 3 upperclassmen and 9 plebes, all my squad mates. And I couldn't remember how to ask to be excused. I couldn't, requesting permission to shove off, I forgot. So I messed that up. And then my platoon leader stood up and he wanted to know what the menu was for morning meal. And I was like, what? Do we have to know that the first day? I didn't think we had to know that the first day, so I didn't know that. And then he went around the table and nobody knew the answer. So I thought, I'm off the hook. And then he pointed his finger at me and he said, Miss Hanley, my maiden name, Miss Hanley, I don't like women in my school. I don't want women in my school. And it'll be my mission to see you are gone before I graduate. Is that clear? And I thought, oh my gosh, welcome aboard. And how do you answer that with one of your 5 basic responses? And I just realized I just needed to stay away from that guy because he was going to be trouble. And but unfortunately, he was my platoon leader, and he did make life miserable. And they actually put his room next to our room, the girls' room. And for the next year, he made our life absolutely miserable. And then right before graduation, when we were moving to our new rooms, he wanted to help us. He wanted to come help the girls move our stuff. We were all like, no, sir, no thanks. So it was pretty clear from the beginning that they didn't want us here. Nobody wanted us here. It was really... The thing about it was, I found it exhausting because you never knew if people liked you when you met someone, you didn't know if they liked you here or they didn't care or they wanted to date you, or you just were always on guard. And the thing for us was the discrimination, the sexism, it was blatant. Some of it was physical, but it was always very verbal. People had no trouble telling us to get out of their school. I was one of the first Navy cheerleaders. Prior to the women coming here, the cheerleaders were gals from local all-women colleges, like Hood College or Mount Mary Washington, I think at the time. And so they brought in these gals who had long hair, because we could only keep our hair really, really short. So they had long hair, they wore makeup and jewelry, and mids could date them. And then when we came on board, the administration decided, well, we've got gals, so we'll use them. They should be cheerleaders. It was funny because prior to that, plebes weren't allowed to be cheerleaders. But then once we were here, we could be cheerleaders. So there were 6 of us. And there were 6 guy cheerleaders, so 12 total. But when they put us down on the sidelines in front of the brigade was brutal. They were brutal. They just called us all kinds of names, told us we were fat and ugly, get off the field, get out of our school. They threw things at us. And the most disappointing thing, I think, for me looking back was that the leadership didn't do anything to stop it. They just let that go on. Like I said, it was kind of exhausting just all the time. You just were always on your guard because there was always somebody who seemed to be coming after you.
That's interesting. Mr. Disher, was that attitude, I can understand might be the wrong word, but why someone who's been here before women were introduced or included in the brigade, why it would take a while for them to lose that kind of attitude. But was that attitude the same in your class after women were introduced? Were there still guys who felt that way?
So it's a very good question. I would say context is important here. So many people may not know how many women were in the first class. Turns out that 81 entered and 55 graduated. So not every company had women. And then in my case, so I was in the class of 81, the second class of women, and it turns out there were women in the class of 80 and women in the class of 81. But even then, very few, because there was, about the same number that were in the class of 81. So there weren't very many women around at all. And generally speaking, because of that, there might be only one room of the class of 81 and one room of the class of 80. So 2 rooms out of all of the company were women. And some companies still did not have women in their company. So to your point, there were men that were in the class of, 77, that was her upper class. Now we're into 78 and 79. So 78 and 79 did not have her women in their classes. And so when I got there were 2 classes that didn't have women and 2 classes that did. I would say that you have to remember where society was back then and what was permissive and what wasn't permissive. And so looking back, you could see how wrong so many things were. And so when I listened to Sharon speak to the midshipmen of today, it's been over 40 years. And so including our daughter has been here. So our daughter graduated 30 years after her mother. And so through her eyes, we were able to see what kind of progress had been made. And probably the biggest progress was the number of women and the law. Well, the law changed. The combat exclusion law changed in 1994. And even until, most recently, 2010, that's when that allowed women to go on submarines. And then even after that, the Secretary of Defense had to say everything is open to all women. And that hasn't been all that long. So look how it's taken many, many, many years for progress and for women to be allowed to do the things that they certainly are capable of doing, have demonstrated their ability, but society and for whatever reason limited themselves probably longer than they needed to, clearly.
The thing for me was in high school, women could do anything. We'd be president of the class, yearbook editor, student council president. We did all that, and no one questioned what we were doing because we were girls. And then we came here, and everything we did was wrong because we were a girl, simply because we were a girl, and we were taking the place of somebody who could have served in a combat position, which was the mission of the Naval Academy. So we were always fighting that battle, that we were taking the place of somebody because we weren't allowed to go into any combat positions. But we all wanted to. We were all willing to do it. It was Congress who was holding us back in that regard. So that was always a hard argument to have. And it's kind of like I'd always say, well, if you never have any women trained up, then you always have a reason not to put them in those positions. But the guys didn't really buy that.
Ma'am, this might be an obvious question, or an obvious answer, but I still think that the question is worth asking. Why do you think the Academy lagged broader society on that issue?
I don't know that they lagged broader society. I mean, I think women still, we still weren't really, there were some women who were lawyers or engineers and doctors, it was still, I think we were pretty much even with society at the time. I think, in fact, that the academies opened up to women was, some people would have called it, they did call it a social experiment. And there were even higher ups in the administration who I've heard stories about with some of the sports teams. One of my best friends was an incredible All-American swimmer, and she's a classmate as well. And she was told by her coach that someone higher up in the department said, don't worry about, dealing with her too much because those women, they're not going to be here next year. And that was our plebe year.
Mrs. Disher, in your book, you discussed how female members of the class of 1980 adopted different methods to endure their experiences. Can you tell us more about these methods and how did they help you all cope with the situation?
Yeah, for us, it was about survival. It was just about getting through and graduating. And so we each found our own way. And some gals became wallflowers and just kind of tried to blend in. And some became promiscuous. And some turned to religion. Some had eating disorders. For me, I decided to become one of the guys. And I could cut down a female classmate as well as any guy. And I could swear as well as any guy. And that was how I fit in and was able to, just keep it going. And I remember one time they were going to have a meeting, all the women. And I was like, oh, no way am I going to that because then it looks like a sewing club, and there was no way I was going to do that. I always just hung with the guys and I could be, as crass as the guys. So that was kind of my survival mechanism. And that's just what it was all about. And then when the next class of women came on board, I think they all I know, because we've talked about it. They all expected us to take them under their wings and, and we were all like, girlfriend, are you crazy? We got so much baggage. We're not carrying your baggage too. We got enough baggage of our own. And they were all kind of like, what? What do you mean? I mean, if you were on a sports team, then maybe you helped out the underclass. But for the most part, we were pretty pretty driven just to survive. And I remember not too long ago, I was at one of class of 81, the gals had a breakfast and they invited me, and I stood up at the breakfast and I said, here to apologize on behalf of the women of Edie. I am here to apologize for, ignoring you guys and, letting you do it on your own.
And Mr. Disher, also in the book, Mrs. Disher mentioned that there's some awkward moments over particularly plebe summer of how male detailers approach finding the right way to train the incoming women. Did you see any of this over your time at the academy?
That's a great question. I don't know whether I've filtered any of those thoughts. I will tell you that I was a squad leader when I was a firstie. I was in first set. I do remember that there were more women in the class of 84 in that case. Again, I think there were so few women that if you didn't want to deal with women, you didn't have to. You could just go do something else. And so the women, unfortunately, would not have benefited from an interaction or not benefited from an interaction with midshipmen. So I think at that point, in those days, if you did not feel that women should be here, I know that there were men that just didn't deal with it. And then, on the other hand, there were men that said, okay, the women are here. They're my classmates, or they're going to be future officers just like me. And I think that they demonstrated probably a more mature attitude than would have been normal back then. And they would try to help the women and listen to them and try to help them adapt and adjust. But I do think the lack of role models, the lack of women company officers, battalion officers in leadership was not helping the cause, because here the women were essentially there by themselves as students in a very large institution. I wasn't there in my 4 years there. I don't think we were there long enough to really notice any trends, because the number of women continued to be small numbers.
Mrs. Disher, I saw you nodding your head during that answer. Do you have anything to add on that?
I can't remember why I was nodding.
Okay.
Well, role models.
Oh, role models, yeah. So it was really difficult for us because we did not have any role models. There were two officers, female officers there. And one of them, she just had talk about a hard road to toe. I mean, she had it even worse than we did because she didn't have any kind of pin. So her credibility was always in question. And so she really was hardcore with us and with everybody. And so nobody liked her because she just was really tough. And then and there was another officer, but she was like the scheduling officer, so you really never saw her. Yeah, so not having role models was a real challenge. And mentoring was not, we never had mentors. Nobody had mentors back then, which could have been very helpful.
Mrs. Disher, was there ever a time when someone clearly crossed the line during your training?
Well, I mean, for me, somebody really crossed the line. And if you read my book, that my second set squad leader called me down to his room one Sunday morning, had the mate come and get me, and then I walked into the room and he didn't have a shirt on and his top button of his trousers was undone, and he told me to sit down. And I thought, what, so I did, and then he leaned over and kissed me, and he said, "Is that okay?" And I'm thinking, oh my God, how do I answer that? And I'm like, I guess so, sir. And he said, okay, you can shove off. And I'm thinking, oh my God. Okay, now what do we do? I mean, this is a week into his 3-week stint as a squad leader. And it was clear that he was attracted to me, but it was clear to everybody. And that was a real problem because my classmates could see what was going on, and I remember bracing myself up once just to pretend that, my squad leader had done it. But so I'm not sure if that's what you're looking for, but yeah, it was just really hard. And then on the other hand, I am a platoon leader who was just being a real jerk. So you've got these two different attitudes towards women there on exact opposite scales from one another.
That's interesting. So it wasn't really even on a spectrum of, finding the right balance. It was just far past the line.
Right. And I think it's like what Tim said, it was out here or it was over there. Like I'm just not going to deal with women. I don't care whether they're here or not. I don't have to deal with them because there's not that many. And so I'm not going to.
That's interesting.
To build off of that, the Academy today has put a lot of effort towards shape training, towards harassment training to ensure that things like that has happened to you doesn't happen in today's brigade. And I was just wondering for you, in your experience at the time at the Academy, was there ever any accountability or policies put by leadership to protect the first class of women or other classes of women from experiencing these type of things?
No, and I think that went on for a really long time. There was nothing. If you reported anything, well, what did you expect? It's an all-boys school. Why did you come here? Boys will be boys. This is what you think was going to happen when you came here. Those were the answers that you got. And if you were sexually assaulted, you must have asked for it. What were you wearing? What did you do? So there was nothing. So you just didn't report anything. You just didn't. And that, I don't know when the SHAPE program or SAPR, when those all started, but I remember coming in here in 1992, and we were back for homecoming game, and I was talking to some of the female midshipmen, and the things they were telling me was, I just couldn't believe it. It had been 12 years since we graduated, and the things I was hearing was just as bad as when we were here. And that's pretty much what incited me to write the book, because I just thought, you know what, it's time. We got to start talking about this, because it's never going to get better if we don't start telling our stories. And so I'm really thrilled that the Academy's come a really long way in that regard.
Mr. Disher, this is a bit of an aside, but if you don't mind me asking, how did both of you meet at the Naval Academy?
So we met, it was fall of my second class year, so fall of her first class year. And we ended up, unbeknownst to either one of us, her classmate in my company actually introduced us. And the reason we were introduced was because we were both headed to the Caribbean for Christmas, both to see our families. And so my father was actually stationed in Roosevelt Roads in Puerto Rico, and her family was living in St. Croix. And so we ended up flying down together, and then and we struck up a conversation on the flight down to the Caribbean. And when we landed, I said, hey, Dad, how do I get over to St. Croix? And he said, well, as a matter of fact, there's a daily helicopter flight that goes over, a Navy helicopter flight, because there was a submarine range over in St. Croix. So I got on one of those flights, helicoptered over from Puerto Rico to St. Croix, spent some time over in St. Croix, and then she came over to Puerto Rico. So there we were. We thought, okay, in the Caribbean, a lot of fun. She'll probably not be happy that I say this, but while we were there, she said, "You know what? I'm never going to date an underclassman." And I'm like, okay, but we're having fun. And of course, when we left Caribbean to come back, it was the Dark Ages. So so we ended up continuing to. So she did date this underclassman, and so we dated for the rest of her time. We ended up getting married in 1985. 5 years later.
Mr. Disher, throughout your 4 years at the Academy, did you notice a attitude change among the male midshipmen? And for you personally, did your attitude ever change with the integration of women throughout the Academy?
I think, it's going to be hard to generalize. Was there an attitude change? I do think that the longer we were here and that we understood why the women were here, that they helped us understand that women are very capable, and so that they can accomplish, what they would like to accomplish, and they were limited by the law at the time. And I think probably one of the biggest obstacles for the women was that they were not allowed to graduate and get commissioned for what the purpose of the Naval Academy was, which is unrestricted line and going into combat. And so I think that was something that the women couldn't argue against, because that's what the law said. And so when most of the men might have thought, and I think that's probably fair to say, that men thought, okay, women are here, they're taking the spot of another person that could graduate and fulfill the goals of the Naval Academy. And until that law changes, why should women be here? So that was a hard argument for anybody to counter. But I will tell you, in my own personal way, I do think that over time I got more mature in my approach about, who my classmates were and how to support. This notion of today we talk about dignity and respect. That's not anything that we really talked about very much in our time back in the late 70s, early 80s. And so I think that some of my actions were immature. I think that, I'm not proud of some of the things that I did toward my female classmates, and I could have respected them a lot better. And I think eventually I did develop a better attitude about that.
Mrs. Disher, we heard that the registrar had to ensure that 2 women were in each class. First of all, is that true? And either way on that, what were classes like for you guys?
So that's interesting. I wasn't aware of that, and I will tell you that there were classes where I was the only female in there. Well, mainly, particularly later in the later years, because I was a systems engineer, and there were 2 women systems engineers, but one dropped down to general engineering, so I was really the only systems engineer. So by first year, I was the only woman in the class, consistently. But I was treated great, by the professors. They were really, some of them just didn't even notice that I was a female. And then some were, a little more, they kind of took me under their wings, which was great. And the guys were great. I mean, my classmates who were systems engineers, we were all really close. So that was really nice.
Mrs. Disher, in your book, you mentioned about the trauma and the scars that sometimes occurred with some of your female classmates. And we all believe that it's really important to have these tough conversations about what happened in history and then how we can learn from them. But just in general, why do you think it was so difficult for many of your classmates to tell their stories today or back then?
Well, when I was researching my book, there were things I heard that I just couldn't believe. I couldn't believe. Like one of my classmates, she told me when she was a plebe, she was taking a shower. And one of her firsties took off his clothes and got in the shower with her and tried to assault her. And I was just astounded because really I was in 33rd Company, which doesn't exist now, but I had a great company. Overall there was some hardcore second classmen who tried to drive us out, but overall it was a really good company. But there were other women who, the stories I heard about their companies and their classmates who would try to drive them out. One gal told me she was studying during study hour one night, and all of a sudden the lights went out in her room. So she went to the door to see what was going on, and her classmates were there, and they threw a pie that they'd brought up from dinner. They threw it in her face and told her to get out of their school. So they had turned off the lights to her room. There were guys who had put dead mice in pillowcases. There were, we had mailboxes. I don't think you guys still have them, but we had these little mailboxes down by the maid's desk, and you'd go and get your mail, and there'd be a dead mouse in there or something. So after hearing those stories, I understood why there's so many of my female classmates who cannot come back. They can't even come back here. And we, quite frankly, we were separated. Like Tim said, not every company. There were 9 companies that had no females. So there's things that happened to women that were just so difficult that we were spread out. We weren't able to support one another. And like I said, I didn't want to be part of a sewing club. I didn't want to support. I wanted to fit in. And so we never helped each other. But in recent years, we've really congealed as a class, or a female class. And we've had activities and reunions just with the women to just get to know each other. And we're really cool people. We are really an amazing group of women. But even with those reunions, there were a lot of women who couldn't even come to those. And we didn't hold them at the academy. We held them, off the yard, so that with hopes that it would be easier for them to come back. But there were things that happened to them, and a lot of things I don't even know, that were just so horrible that they just couldn't come back. And I know there were a couple of Napsters. We had a couple of Napster women in our class. Actually, we had 3. One didn't show up Friday. The other one quit plebe summer, and the third one, she told stories of, at Naps they lit the girls' room on fire. Yeah, because they didn't want them there. And when they went down to lunch, they had to sit at their own table. Nobody would sit with them. So it was just so stories like that at such a formative time in your life, I think they just stay with you forever. And you guys will find out later that this place, how can a 4-year part of your life matter so much? But it does. And it affects men as well, I think. It's not just the women. But so that stuff that happened back then it's sometimes really hard to overcome.
Mrs. Disher, you write in your introduction to your book, I Love the Naval Academy. So is that an act of overlooking some of the difficult things, or are the two more interrelated?
I do love the Naval Academy, and truly, my book is the tip of the iceberg. There's so many stories. You can really read between the lines. But the Naval Academy is a wonderful place, and it just kind of was following the sign of the times back then. I mean, I get what was happening, but I have an amazing life because of the Naval Academy. I met an amazing man. I have 3 wonderful children. I had a great career. I mean, I stayed in for 10 years. I was in the Civil Engineer Corps. I had a great time in the Navy. Everything I've been given, and it's a lot. I mean, I tell people I was Saint Mother Teresa in a previous life because this life is so amazing. And it was because of the Naval Academy. So I do love the Academy. But there are times when I struggle with the progress being a little slower than I had hoped. But, it took us over 70 years to get the vote, for women to get the vote. So it's only been 40 years. But it just, progress is just slow. Change is slow. Change is hard and change is slow. But it's come really far, and I see the women of today and the men of today, and I tell my female classmates, listen, these individuals are amazing. They're amazing. And what we did was worth it. It was really hard, but I'm telling you, you should come back and see what we helped create, because it was worth it because of the midshipmen of today.
Mr. Disher, I think this is a good segue into some of the more general questions we have about culture at the Naval Academy. So Mrs. Disher asked the question, how is it that a 4-year institution has such an impact on your lives?
I don't really give that a whole lot of thought, other than the evidence is today my best friends are my classmates. I think it goes back to your very first question, which was, why did you join the Naval Academy? So we gave you an answer, and it turns out that we wanted to do something bigger than ourselves. And of course, we didn't really know what that meant at the time. And then we found out what that meant. And I really think that sense of purpose, and working with people that have that sense of purpose, there's a lot that's the glue that binds everybody. And so that's why when you graduate from here and you immediately meet somebody that graduated from here or another academy, you instantly have a connection. And it's because you all believe in something, serving something other than yourself. And so it's easy to meet with people and find things in common. And whether they stay in the military or not, as our mission statement says, we know that the inculcation of those values will serve you well in the military and just as a citizen, no matter what you're going to do. So I think that it's that we feel so strongly about that, that it's easy to stay in touch and to continue to relate with those kinds of people.
Anything to add on that, Mrs. Disher?
No, I would agree with Tim. My best friends today are our classmates, and it's funny because there were, like I said, there were women who found different survival mechanisms than I did, and some of them had bad reputations because of that, and so therefore I didn't want anything to do with them or be associated with them because I didn't want to get that kind of reputation either, and yet today, some of those women are my best friends. I realized what they went through wasn't the truth, and it wasn't really their fault, and they're trying to heal, and that we have that common bond of what we went through is just something really, really special.
To add on to that, Mrs. Disher, Were you and your female classmates aware of the historic nature that you're having a huge impact on the brigade and perhaps broader society as a whole during your time at the academy? How did you guys feel about that, and did you ever think about it during your time there?
Yeah, it's funny, we've talked about that quite a bit, and none of us were there to prove a point or to be pioneers.
It was like you were so busy that that wasn't even on your mind. And it wasn't until later. I even think that today, in 2021, Sharon and I have this conversation, and I may have misunderstand this from time to time, but I think that she doesn't think that she has anything to offer the women of today that are midshipmen. And I said, on the contrary, I think, and I see it every time she interacts with a midshipman. I see her light up. I see the midshipmen light up. I see the connection, and I think that she now appreciates, to the point of your question about what she went through, and she sees what the women are doing today, and it makes it all worth it. But back then, that wasn't even on her radar. I mean, that wasn't why she was here. She was just trying to fulfill her life's ambitions about making a difference. So
Right. But given that, I think we felt a lot of pressure to prove ourselves too, because we were taking the spot of some guy who could have been in combat. And so it was really challenging.
It's still work in progress back then, right? So where will the women go? Will they ever be able to serve in combat? The hope is yes. I mean, it makes so much sense that a lot of capability that if we ignore, it's going to be at the risk of the peril of our country if we don't take advantage of that.
Well, that reminds me of a quote that I saw in your book, Mrs. Disher, from the Chief of Naval Operations at your commencement ceremony. I'd like to read that and then ask what your thoughts are about it. Some of you are puzzling why I haven't made a big deal about this being the first class ever to count women among its graduates. It seems to me it's about time we stop making firsts out of these young women. I'm confident they're tired of it. They have met the test. They have earned just as smart a salute and just as much respect as any other graduate. How did that make you feel when you heard that?
Thank goodness. Thank goodness. Oh my gosh. The last thing we wanted was to be highlighted above our male classmates. We had done this as a class. We had done this as a team. And I was so grateful. I think we were all so grateful that he didn't make a big deal about that. Because I know a lot of people were. Because I was in the very last row, and there was a huge platform of reporters behind me, and they were taking pictures all the time. And hey, wave to your mom, and hey, do that. And it's like, okay, you guys just leave me alone. I just want to enjoy my graduation. So it was really a relief that he just made it no big deal.
And this is a question for both of you, but despite the large amount of progress that the Academy has made since your time at the Academy, what do you think the Academy can do better today to better integrate women into the Academy and to create a better, more inviting culture for everyone at the Academy?
Man, I from what I've seen, we're doing a good job. I am disappointed to hear from women who say, well, every now and then there's a bad apple, but maybe every now and then there's just going to be a bad apple. But I kind of go, hey, guys, you weren't even born when there weren't women at the Academy. So where's this coming from? Is this passed down from generations of your family who are in the military? Do you hear it from them? Do you hear it from alumni, sponsors? Like, where's this coming from? So, or is this an insecurity thing on your part? I don't know where that comes from, but it's so seldom. I'm so pleased to hear that a lot of the women just are like, no, it's no big deal. And the other really cool thing for me is back then, like I told you, whenever you tried to report something, boys will be boys. But so we just put up with so much stuff and just tried to let it roll off. Whereas today, women will say, hey, you can't say that kind of stuff. That's not appropriate. Don't say that. They call people out. And so I'm really excited about that kind of change, because we never would have. We just would, take it on and walk away.
I do think that, we've actually lived in Annapolis since 2003. And so we have 3 children. And so when we moved back here, our kids got to be interested in coming to the academy. And I will tell you that since that time, we have actually seen quite a bit of emphasis about the number of women that have been accepted into the Naval Academy. And we've seen that the influence and the impact that has made. And that over time, as Sharon said, there's so many positive things that seem to be taking place from an institutional perspective, not only from the Navy, but from the Naval Academy, leadership, the women role models, the women that are coming back to the academy that were in combat. There's a Navy captain female that's the commanding officer of an aircraft carrier, a carrier air wing. A 4-star admiral that was in the class of '82. And so the women are kicking butt, and and probably the proof in the pudding is whenever we run into female midshipmen and male midshipmen, we talk about it, and we don't see the things that we saw when we were midshipmen, and that is so that's very empowering, and we're very, very excited about that.
One broader question again about culture of the Naval Academy. What would you like to see preserved into the future about Naval Academy culture that had a particular impact on you and either your naval career or your life afterwards?
I think plebe summer is something that we're all glad that is in our rearview mirror. But I do think when you talk about a crucible of leadership, formative experiences, there's no substitute for that. And so I like that connotation of pressure with a purpose, right? And dignity and respect. So things are hard, and you find that you can grow in so many ways. That's what this place allows you to do. I do think this is the right place, not for everybody. It has to be the right place. It has to be the right person coming here. I like that the institution works really hard to make sure that midshipmen on I-Day, that's probably not the first time they've been to Annapolis. Once upon a time, that was the case. But we're trying to make people better informed about what to expect when they get here. And then it's pressure with a purpose, but it's pressure with purpose for people that have an idea about what they're getting themselves into. So I think, testing our character is so important, and developing ethical leaders are what we as a country need. And I think that's one of the tenets of a Naval Academy education.
Yeah, I would say that this isn't really something we've been doing, but I think it's something we should do. And our son is class of 2010, and he went on a cruise with the Spanish Navy for a summer cruise. And in foreign navies, their midshipmen are actually the ones driving the ship, standing the watch. And I just think we waste a lot of midshipmen's time by going on ships and watching movies and hanging out and, eating ice cream versus really participating as an active part of the crew. So for me, I actually was on it's funny because the two women who went in the Civil Engineer Corps were on the first combatant. We were actually on a destroyer for first class cruise. And I got to be, assistant fire control officer and really participate the whole time I was on the ship. And so I wish we would do more of that on our midshipman cruises.
Mrs. Disher, what are lessons from your experiences that should be learned by the Academy, by the military, and broader society as a whole?
I feel like we have learned them. I feel like we are moving forward, like you said, with the shape and the sapper and that kind of thing. And just honestly, for me, if we as a nation could just treat each other with dignity and respect. It's such a basic tenet for me. It's so simple. Just treat everyone, even if you have disagreements, if you don't agree with politics or whatever's going on. If we could just learn once again to treat each other with dignity and respect, put down our phones and have a conversation one-on-one with people and just listen and be accepting of one another. And once again, the dignity and respect for everyone.
Mrs. Disher, we're nearing the end of our time, but I'd like to ask you this because I ran into the plebe that I mentored last year, actually, on the way in here, and I asked her what she would like to ask if she was sitting in the room right now, and she said, was it worth it? So was it worth it to go through all of these difficult experiences?
You tell her, but because of young women like her and young men like you guys, it was all worth it.
Well, Mr. and Mrs. Disher, you've been very generous with your time, and we thank you very much for joining us today and offering your perspectives. We couldn't thank you enough.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thank you, guys.
This concludes our interview with Mr. and Mrs. Disher about the first class of women to join the ranks at the Naval Academy. We want to thank Mr. and Mrs. Disher for spending their time with us and for sharing their perspectives and experience. This has been the Midshipmen-produced podcast, Life at the Academy, recording from the Naval Academy's Sampson Hall in Annapolis, Maryland. On behalf of the USNA History Department and our midshipmen hosts and producers, thank you for listening. We look forward to seeing you next time.